Open any social platform and the war in Gaza arrives in fragments. A clip with no date, a number with no source, a headline that contradicts the one directly beneath it. This video is not going to tell you who is right. What it will do is take the claims that circulate most, put the available figures beside them, and show you exactly where each figure came from. That last part is the whole point, so it is worth being blunt about it now. Almost every number you have seen about this war originates with someone who has an interest in it. Israeli military figures come from the Israeli military. Casualty totals come from a health ministry administered by Hamas. International agencies sit somewhere in between, and they are working with partial access to a war zone. None of that makes the numbers worthless. It makes them evidence with a fingerprint on it. There is a habit in coverage of this war of laundering that fingerprint away. A figure originates as a claim, gets repeated by an outlet, gets aggregated into a graphic, and by the fourth repetition, it has become a fact with no author. Nothing was fabricated at any step. The provenance simply evaporated. That process is not unique to this conflict. It is how almost all contested information travels. But this war has produced an unusual volume of it, at unusual speed, into an audience with unusually strong feelings. So every figure in this video carries its source on screen as it appears. Where a number is a claim by a party to the fighting, the label says claim. Where it is a count, the label says who did the counting. Where nobody actually knows, we will say that too, because on several of the questions people argue about most confidently, that is the honest answer. That is a slower way to make a video. It is also the only honest way to hand you the material and say, decide for yourself. Start with a number you have almost certainly seen, 500 trucks a day. Before the war, roughly 500 trucks entered Gaza on a normal working day. That figure is real, and it gets quoted constantly as the benchmark for how much aid should be arriving. What gets lost is what was on them. Of those 500, only about 150 to 180 carried food. The rest carried cement, steel, fuel, machinery, consumer goods. The material of an economy, not a food supply. That single distinction changes how you read almost every aid statistic in this war. A truck is not a unit of food. Two convoys of identical size can carry completely different things, and counting vehicles tells you almost nothing about how many calories cross the line. It cuts both ways, which is why it is worth knowing. It undercuts anyone claiming that a given day's truck count proves adequate supply. It equally undercuts anyone comparing wartime totals against that 500 figure as though the pre-war baseline was 500 trucks of food. The second thing that gets lost is where aid actually fails. Getting a pallet through a crossing is not the same as getting it to a family. Between the gate and the plate sit active combat zones, collapsed roads, fuel shortages, armed looting of convoys, and aid agencies attempting to run distribution in a place where their own staff are being killed in significant numbers. Fuel is the hidden variable in all of it. Without diesel, trucks do not move, bakeries do not bake, water pumps do not pump, and hospital generators fail. A crossing can be open and the supply chain behind it can still be effectively dead. There is also a difference between aid entering and aid arriving that almost never survives into a headline. A shipment can clear inspection, cross the line, and then sit in a yard on the other side because no driver will run the route, or because the warehouse it was bound for no longer exists. Agencies report those as two separate numbers. Coverage almost always quotes the first one. The defense argument is that these are logistical failures rather than policy. The counter-argument is that a party controlling the crossings, the fuel supply, and the road network bears responsibility for conditions downstream of them too. Both of those can be substantially true at once, and that is exactly the part that does not survive compression into a 15-second clip. What is not in dispute is the outcome. Severe, sustained food insecurity across the Strip, documented by agencies working on the ground throughout. So when you see a truck count, ask the second question. Not how many, what was on them, and where did they end up? Under international humanitarian law, hospitals and schools carry special protection. That protection is close to absolute, and it exists because the alternative is unthinkable. But it is not unconditional, and the condition is the thing almost nobody explains. Protection ceases if a protected site is used to commit acts harmful to the enemy. That is the actual legal language from the Geneva Conventions and their additional protocols. A hospital used as a hospital is protected. A hospital used as a command post is, in legal terms, something else. The Israeli military, along with American and independent intelligence assessments, has argued that Hamas systematically places military infrastructure inside and beneath civilian buildings. Command centers, weapons stores, and tunnel shafts under schools, mosques, and hospitals. If that is accurate, it creates a deliberate trap. Strike the site and the destruction is filmed and broadcast within the hour. Do not strike it and the position holds. The tactic is designed so that either outcome produces a win, and using civilians that way is itself a war crime, regardless of what the other side then does. But here is the part the defense argument tends to skip, and it matters enormously. Losing protected status does not make a site a free target. Three things still apply. First, a warning must generally be given, with a reasonable time limit, before protection is treated as lost. Second, proportionality still binds. The expected civilian harm must not be excessive relative to the concrete and direct military advantage anticipated. Third, that judgment has to be made afresh for every strike, and it is reviewable afterwards. So the honest version is narrower than either headline. The presence of a military target inside a hospital is not automatically a war crime by the attacker, nor is it automatically a defense for whatever follows. It moves the question from, is this protected, to was this proportionate? And proportionality is a genuinely hard legal test that depends on what the commander knew at the time, what the anticipated advantage was, and what alternatives existed. Those are not things you can assess from a phone screen, in either direction. The casualty totals you have seen quoted almost all trace to one source, the Gaza Ministry of Health. That ministry is administered by Hamas. It is also, in practice, the only body counting comprehensively inside the Strip, and several independent reviews have found its historical figures broadly consistent with other estimates. But there is one thing about that data that is not in dispute, including by the ministry itself. It does not differentiate between combatants and civilians. A fighter and a child appear in the same column. That is not a conspiracy. It is a health ministry counting bodies, not a military doing target assessment. But it means that any statement of the form "this many civilians have been killed" is doing something the underlying data does not support. The Israeli military states it has killed tens of thousands of combatants. That is a claim by a party to the war, and it is not independently verifiable either. So we have one count that does not separate the categories, and one claim that cannot be checked. Any ratio built from those two is an argument wearing a statistics clothing. Instead of arguing about a ratio neither side can prove, look at something directly observable. The Israeli military has dropped millions of warning leaflets. It has made recorded phone calls to specific buildings. It has broadcast evacuation maps dividing the Strip into numbered blocks and published which blocks were about to be struck. You can argue about whether those warnings were adequate, and the criticisms are serious. Whether people had anywhere to go in a sealed territory. Whether the timelines were survivable for the elderly, the wounded, or patients on ventilators. Whether telecommunications blackouts made phone warnings meaningless. Whether areas designated as safe were later struck anyway, which in several documented instances they were. All of that is legitimate criticism, and none of it is settled. There is also a hard limit on what a warning can achieve in a territory nobody can leave. In most wars, a warned population moves out of the conflict zone entirely. In Gaza, the borders are closed, so warned civilians move from one part of a small strip to another part of the same strip, sometimes repeatedly, and sometimes into areas that are struck later. A warning that relocates people rather than removing them from danger is doing something genuinely different from a warning in an open theater. But the practice itself is documented and uncontested, and it points somewhere specific. A force whose objective was to maximize civilian deaths would not spend 2 years telling the civilian population where the next strike is going to land. The word genocide has a legal definition, and it is narrower than its everyday use. It comes from the 1948 Convention, drafted in the shadow of the Holocaust, largely at the urging of a Polish Jewish lawyer named Raphael Lemkin, who lost 49 members of his family in it. He invented the word because the crime had no name and therefore no law. The definition turns on one phrase: acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. Intent is the hinge. Not scale, not death toll, not destruction. Intent. That is deliberately demanding, and it is demanding for a reason. Lemkin and the drafters wanted a category that could not be diluted into a synonym for atrocity, because if everything is genocide, then the word protects nobody. Courts applying it since have generally required that intent be the only reasonable inference available from the pattern of conduct. The stated operational objectives of the Israeli campaign are to dismantle Hamas's military and governing capability and to recover the hostages taken on October the 7th. Those are the declared goals, and declared goals are evidence of intent, though not conclusive evidence. Statements by individual officials that appear to go further have also been widely reported, and those cut the other way. Gaza is also one of the most densely populated places on Earth. Roughly 2.2 million people in 365 square kilometers. Urban warfare at that density produces catastrophic civilian harm almost regardless of the care taken, and the destruction there is real and enormous by any measure. The counterargument runs like this. A military with the firepower to level the strip in days, operating over a period of years, with the population repeatedly warned and repeatedly moved, produces a pattern that is difficult to reconcile with an intent to destroy a people as such. You may find that persuasive, or you may not. Reasonable people examining the same record have reached opposite conclusions, and this is genuinely contested rather than settled. But the argument is about intent, because under the convention, that is the only thing the word actually turns on. Now widen the frame, because this is the part almost nothing in your feed will show you. While Gaza has dominated global coverage, another war has been running in parallel, and it is larger by nearly every measure that usually drives attention. Sudan. Civil war since April 2023 between the National Army and the Rapid Support Forces. Tens of thousands killed. Around 12 million people driven from their homes. The United Nations has described it as the largest displacement crisis on Earth, with tens of millions facing acute hunger and famine conditions confirmed in multiple locations. 12 million displaced. That is more people than live in Sweden, uprooted, in under 3 years. It has not produced sustained front pages. It has not produced campus encampments. Most people watching this could not name either side. Then there is Syria, where sectarian massacres, including mass killings targeting the Druze community, have involved exactly the kind of documented, targeted, ethnic violence that generates global outrage elsewhere. The international response was comparatively muted. The point is not that Gaza deserves less attention. Suffering is not a competition, and pointing at Sudan does not answer a single question about Gaza. Anyone using one atrocity to wave away another is doing something dishonest, and that is not the argument here. The point is what the asymmetry tells you about the machinery. Coverage is not distributed according to the scale of human suffering. It is distributed according to geopolitical salience, journalist access, the cost and danger of reporting, whether a conflict fits an existing narrative frame, and whether audiences already hold opinions the story can attach to. Sudan fails almost every one of those tests. It is expensive and lethal to report from. It maps onto no familiar Western political fault line, and most audiences have no prior stake in the outcome. So it happens in the dark. Once you can see that mechanism, you cannot unsee it. And it should prompt a harder question about every conflict you have strong feelings about. Not just what do I think, but why did this one reach me at all, and what am I not seeing because nobody could afford to film it? So where does that leave you? A truck is not a unit of food. A hospital can lose its protection and still not be a lawful target. A casualty total that does not separate combatants from civilians cannot answer a question about civilians. Genocide is a claim about intent, not about scale. And the conflicts that reach you are selected by a process that has very little to do with how many people are dying. None of that tells you what to conclude. That is deliberate. Anyone who watched this hoping it would hand them a verdict was always going to be disappointed, because the honest position on several of these questions is that the evidence is contested and the people arguing loudest are usually the ones who have looked least. War is destructive and tragic, and it does not become less so because the legal categories are complicated. But the categories exist for a reason, and collapsing them costs something real. A word that means everything ends up meaning nothing, precisely when it is needed most. Look at the figures. Check who produced them. Notice what a number does not say as carefully as what it does. Then decide for yourself. Everything in this video has been an argument for complexity. This last part is not. Regardless of how you read the facts on the ground, there is one trend that requires absolute clarity: the alarming rise in anti-Semitism. Criticizing a government's military policy is ordinary free speech. It is legitimate, it is necessary, and it is what citizens of democracies do about every government, including their own. but using this conflict as cover to harass Jewish people, to vandalize synagogues, or to demand that individual Jews answer for the actions of a foreign government crosses into something else. That is not criticism. That is bigotry, and it is the oldest one there is. The test is simple, and it has nothing to do with your position on the war. It is whether you are addressing a policy or a people, whether you are asking a government to answer or asking a person to answer for a government they did not elect and may not support. You can be deeply concerned for the people of Gaza. You can demand a ceasefire. You can find every argument in this video unconvincing. And you can still hold the line that a global community of roughly 15 million people is not answerable for a war fought by a state most of them do not live in. We have to stand up, call out the misinformation, and stop the spread of anti-Jewish hate in our own communities. One last thing. This channel makes videos like this one. Long, sourced, and considerably slower than the algorithm would prefer. If that is the kind of thing you want more of, there are two things that genuinely help. Subscribe, so the next one actually reaches you. And leave a comment, because a video people argue about in good faith travels a lot further than one nobody responds to. And if you think something here was wrong, say so, and say why. Point at the specific number, and tell me where it came from. That was the entire method of this video, and it applies to this video too. Thanks for watching.